Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Edwards, and I'm the Artistic Director here at Eventide Theater Company. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of this afternoon to join us today for this very special members event. Today, we are going to be having a wonderful conversation with Sue Mellen. This is part of our ongoing commitment at Eventide Theater to continue to bring to you live events, programming, and theater as we have since this entire pandemic began. And we will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. This is our way of saying thank you to all of you who have supported us as members and have supported us with our programming and have supported Eventide Theater in everything that we have done over the past year, from our drop-in Shakespeare to our Eventide Tales to our virtual Playhouse. We have many, many more things that we have planned coming up, and none of that would be available to us without the support of our members and our patrons. So thank you. As a special thank you to all of our members who are in attendance at this webinar today, you will all be receiving a signed copy of Sue's book. So we want to thank you all for coming out today, and we look forward to getting those into your hands. Just before we started this, Sue handed me a box full of them already signed and ready to go. So we're excited to get those out to you. We do encourage you, if you enjoy this programming and you want to continue to support us, not just as members, but to continue to offer financial support, we would encourage you to consider making a donation. You can do that by texting the letters ETC to the number 44321, and that will bring you to a secure page, or you can go to our website, which is eventidearts.org, and you can make a donation there. All of your donations, all of your support helps to continue to bring this programming to you, as well as our upcoming programming. As you may know, we have announced an upcoming season for 2021, which we have committed not to cancel, not to postpone, and not to reschedule into another year as a result of anything going on in the world around us. As a result of that, it's forced us to be a little nimble and a little creative. Our first production, Teacher of the Year, which is being produced in partnership with the Katuitt Center for the Arts, opens on May 28th, and we'll have new episodes dropping every Saturday. It's a unique presentation specifically written for the Zoom medium, and it speaks to the current state of the world from the perspective of a teacher in a rural community. So I definitely encourage you to check that one out. It's going to be quite an experience. Following that, on July 4th weekend, actually opening on July 1st, we'll be premiering another innovative piece, Twain by the Tail, directed by Stephen Rourke and produced by Toby Wilson, who was our interviewer today. That production is being produced with all of our actors performing green screen, and it's going to be quite an experience. Everybody has been socially distanced, and at the same time, they're still bringing to the table some fantastic performances. So we will be returning to our live productions starting in September with the Steve Ross directed piece, The Last 5 Years. And we have pledged, if we cannot present that in the theater, we will do it outside. If we can't do it outside, we will find another way in which to bring that production to you, but we will follow through with our season as promised. And our final production sees the return of a favorite author of ours, Rich Orloff, and his play Ha, which is 3 one-act pieces, which will be directed by Toby Wilson. Speaking of Toby Wilson, Toby is going to be our interviewer here today in this conversation with Sue Mellen, and we're excited to have him hosting. So ladies and gentlemen, I am going to throw things over to Toby and let him take it from here. Toby?
Thank you, Chris. And I want to thank our guest today, Sue Mellen. Sue, you've written a book about the history of Cape Cod theater, and I think it's a wonderful time for it to be coming out right now, just in the moment where we feel like we are stepping away from doing just Zoom meetings and online versions, and looking forward to actually getting back into the theaters with our audiences. Just want to let all of you know that if you have any questions for Sue, you can pose them to Chris in the chat room, and we will be looking at those questions and asking Sue before the end of the program today. I'm going to be asking her a bunch of questions about her book, and then about halfway through, we have a video we are going to show for you that Sue has put together of historic photographs of of Cape Theater in, over the years, and it's a wonderful little video, and we will be getting to your questions after that. But thank you, Sue.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Here is the book right here. It is released and it's available in bookstores now, and I'd encourage you to read it. It is very nostalgic for many of us because some of the pictures that are included are from recent productions, and it's just fun to look back and see what the history of Cape Cod theater is and where all of the theaters came from. And so let me first start off with a couple of questions for you, Sue.
Great, sure.
What makes the Cape such a special place for doing theater?
Well, I think it's the history, and I'm a little biased about that, but of course we have such a tradition that began in Provincetown with the Provincetown Players and Eugene O'Neill and the Barnstormers. So there's this feeling that the Cape is about arts and culture and has been about theater for more than 100 years. And also there's just such a level of expertise. Part of that is because there are so many theater companies. Before the pandemic began, there were almost 3 dozen, and I think most of them really have survived the pandemic and are still producing either virtual or a combination of virtual and live performances. But you really have to be good to be a theater company on the Cape, because the level is so high. It really is New York quality. And performers move from theater company to theater company, bringing that expertise with them, bringing whether it's acting or directing or managing or technical expertise from company to company. So theater goers can be assured again and again of having just a unique and incredibly entertaining experience on the Cape. And that really sets the Cape apart. It really puts it in the realm of a place like New York.
Well, why don't you tell us about the origins of theater on the Cape, because it wasn't here all the time.
No, it really wasn't. Well, I mean, there were things like vaudeville and European style.
And musical.
Right, and European style presentations. But it all began really with the Provincetown Players in Provincetown. And there was also, what many people don't know, is there was also an actors colony on Nantucket in Seaconset. And that was the Sconset Actors Colony, which actually began at the end of the 19th century and ran through really until the turn of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century. But when we really think of the dramatic beginning, I mean, it could sort of be that central scene in the play about Cape Cod theater, and that's Eugene O'Neill in Provincetown, with a little play called Bound East for Cardiff, which was produced on July 28th of 1916. And that really started it all, because that was the first time that playwrights were dealing with truly American drama, with truly American issues, with characters that exemplified American life. And it was the start of something brand new.
And that production, too, was right out at the end of the wharf.
It was Lewis Wharf, right, in Provincetown, yeah.
And the doors on the back of the wharf were open, so
yes,
they had the sea in the background, and they had fog coming in.
Right. And a tremendous rainstorm that night. There are, in fact, historical accounts from that night that talk about the theater shaking with the thunder and then shaking with applause later on. And Eugene O'Neill actually was in the wings, and he was prompting his writers, giving them, his actors, giving them lines because they only had a few days to perform, to rehearse. And And so the wonderful dramatic scene
Mm-hmm.
for the opening of that show, which meant so much.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
you said that, he helped to create a truly American style of theater
Right.
at that time. What was different about the plays of Eugene O'neill compared to the regular popular theater at the
Right.
time?
Well, he dealt with American issues like class issues, and his characters were truly American. His lead character in Bound East was a character named Yank.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was no mistaking it that
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about America. We're not talking about London or Paris or Beijing. We're talking about America.
Mm-hmm. And how many of his plays originated in Provincetown that were eventually brought to, the greater theater world?
Yeah, there was a whole slate from that summer of 1916.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say there were probably half a dozen. And then, of course, there are the plays of Tennessee Williams that followed soon after that, which
Mm-hmm.
also originated in Provincetown.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Now, beyond Provincetown, in terms of history of Cape Cod theater, there's the Cape Playhouse. And what did the Cape Playhouse, what role did the Cape Playhouse play in the establishment of the Cape as a theater destination?
Sure. Well, what's interesting to know about the Playhouse is that was actually the brainchild of Raymond Moore, who was himself a Provincetown player.
Mm.
He was performing and also writing. He was a playwright for the Players and for the Barnstormers, which was another group that started early on in Provincetown. And he was looking for a place in the Mid-Cape area that would be closer to the business area of the Cape. So he came and eventually found an old meeting house, the Nabscusset Meeting House, which he had transferred to this piece of land, to this 3-acre piece of land. And what's different about all of that is that he was thinking of a theater colony, an art colony.
Mm-hmm.
He was looking for something more than just a theater. So he created not only the Playhouse, but then the Cape Cinema. And then there were other buildings on the property that served purposes, a junior theater.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and from the very beginning, he brought in luminaries.
Mm-hmm.
The very first season, Basil Rathbone performed, right? And there's the great story about Betty Davis starting her career as an usher at the Cape Playhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really, I think, what's distinguished the Cape Playhouse. And by the way, they're the oldest continually operating summer theater in America.
Mm-hmm. Now, this was at a time where I imagine the Cape began to develop more of a reputation as a vacation place, and
right.
The railroads were established to
yes.
get here,
yes.
and so they began to not only, do plays that were, going to New York, but rather developing plays and bringing in New York plays for the New York audience and the Boston audience to come and see.
Exactly, because they could get here with the railroad, right?
Yeah.
And that was true not only of patrons, but of the actors as well. I mean, they had a direct line. That's what helped build some of these actors' colonies. But of course, one of the reasons that people were coming from New York was because there was no air conditioning in the theaters. so they were coming to a place that was cooler, and the actors also. I mean, they wanted to spend summer on the Cape rather than in a little theater somewhere in Broadway,
or just being in New York in the summertime.
Exactly,
and, it was an
gritty
opportunity to get away.
Right, gritty and hot and uncomfortable.
The number of actors who did come to the Playhouse is really pretty stunning for people who are not aware of its history, because you have Henry Fonda, you have Basil Rathbone, you have Douglas Fairbanks Jr.
Tallulah Bankhead.
Tallulah Bankhead.
Right,
and,
yes.
So that started to make the Cape a destination where you not only got a great vacation, but you got to see top flight talent as well.
Yes, and generations of acting families too. There are pictures of Henry Fonda and Jane Fonda sort of standing around at the Cape Playhouse discussing something, and so it's a great a great sense that these families were here as well. Yeah.
And this leads to the next question, which is, cultural tourism is an important part of our region's economy. And I think it's important for everyone to know that the theaters are generators of income for the local economy.
Incredibly, 600,000 people in a normal summer see a performance on a Cape. In a Cape theater. That's amazing when you think about it. It's an incredible number. And think of what that does to the area economy, that there are so many people that are then eating out and staying in motels and renting cottages and buying homes. And
well, you had an interesting statistic in the book, which that the people who come to the Cape for theater generate significantly more income for the economy than just, people who are coming here just to go to the beach. It's a remarkable amount of money that gets generated through the theaters.
Right.
In addition to the Provincetown Playhouse and the Cape Playhouse, your book covers the history of each of the individual theaters on the Cape, even some who are not around anymore, unfortunately. Now, what strikes me is that in addition to the sheer number of theater companies, many of them are decades old and institutions in their own right.
Absolutely. Barnstable Comedy Club, 100 years old.
No.
And of course, the Cape Playhouse.
Cape Playhouse
is almost 100 years old. The Cape Cod Theater Company, Harwich Junior Theater, 70 years old. Monomoy, 1934. And even the Chatham Drama Guild, which is a community theater company, started in 1934.
Yeah, so that's amazing.
So it's a real testament not only to the theater companies but to the communities that have supported these theaters all these years.
Well, along those lines, you've put together a video for us of various different theaters on the Cape, and we're going to look at that now. Anything you'd like to say to just set that up, or is it just self-explanatory?
I think it's self-explanatory. There is a lot of art, which I think does help move the video along. Yeah. So I hope your viewers enjoy that.
Okay. Let's have a look at that video now, if we could.
It's a summer's eve on Cape Cod, and everywhere there are the sounds of waves lapping against the shore, gulls crying out, and children laughing and chattering as they play an endless game of tag with the waves. But there are also other sounds. There's the soaring sound of an orchestra tuning up, and the sound of laughter at perfectly played physical comedy, and then dramatic lines hitting the air like a knife blade. Those are the sounds of summer theater on Cape Cod. Every summer and increasingly into the fall season, people come from all over the world to see New York quality theater on Cape Cod without the hustle and bustle and heat and grit and grime of the city. They're treated to world-class theater. In fact, according to the Cape Cod Theater Coalition, 600,000 people actually view performances in a normal summer on Cape Cod. Now, unfortunately, this past summer has not been what we would call an average summer on the Cape. Unfortunately, the theaters have been darkened. But theaters have continued through the pandemic to produce virtual productions and performances and acting classes all through the summer and have continued so into the fall. So what is it about theater on Cape Cod that makes it world quality? And one of the things is fierce competition. There are actually more than 36 theater companies, and that number is continuing to increase every year. So 36 theater companies across the small spit of land and the islands on Cape Cod. But there's something more. There's a long-standing tradition of theater on the Cape that goes back more than 100 years. In fact, it all began in what was once a sleepy little fishing village called Provincetown, which became a mecca for artists and writers and playwrights and performers, and to this day is still a mecca for artists of every description. And that theater tradition traveled across the Cape, up and down and into the islands. So let's look at where it all began, and that's at the Land's End. Or for our purposes, we might say the land's beginning. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there was really a revolution in all of the arts and all around the world. There were writers like Henry David Thoreau and Henry James, and then visual artists like Monet and Manet, and of course Pablo Picasso in Europe, who were breaking new ground. And what they wanted to do was to break free of the strictures of European-style theater and the arts and literature and create something that was uniquely modern. And in Provincetown, there was an artist, Charles Webster Hawthorne, who in fact had a school for artists, and he was teaching a technique called en plein air. Now, as the name sort of tells you, it was exactly what it says. It was teaching artists to create the natural world, to translate the natural world in a natural way to canvas. And that was attracting, beginning with visual artists, was bringing in visual artists from places like Boston and New York, where they would hop on a train and then eventually wend their way to the forming artist colony in Provincetown. And in fact, by 1916, the Boston Globe had printed a headline that said, "World's Greatest and Biggest Artist Colony in Provincetown." And playwrights were making their way to this colony as well. One of them was Susan Glaspell, who was a well-known playwright in her time, and she was actually convincing other artists and performers and playwrights to make their way to the art colony in Provincetown. And one of those was Eugene O'Neill. And he was a fledgling playwright at the time. And if you know anything about theater history, then that's a name that should jump out on you, because without exaggeration, Eugene O'Neill was responsible for transforming American drama into a truly American art form. In fact, in a little play called Bound East for Cardiff, which was produced on, for the first time, was staged in a little rickety fishing house that was transformed into a little theater in a wharf in P-Town. And that was on July 28th in 1916. And that was really the beginning. That and other works of his that followed were the very beginning of American drama as we know it today. He created characters that were uniquely American. In fact, his lead character in Bound East was Yank, and dealt with subjects that were uniquely American, like class issues that weren't being dealt with in other places at that time. So through that summer of 1916, the little vanguard of playwrights continued to produce works, avant-garde works of their own, and to perform in one another's plays and direct one another's plays. So it became this thriving art community, artist community in Provincetown. Then by the fall, they decided to take their success and go to Gotham with it. So they went to New York, which they thought was going to be just one season. And actually, it turned out to be 7 seasons that they were in New York. And they inhabited a theater that was originally called the Playwrights Theater, and then became known as the Provincetown Playhouse, obviously as a nod to their beginnings in Provincetown. So during that time, however, they were going back and forth between New York and Provincetown, and continued to act in productions on the wharf. Unfortunately, though, in 1917, the Little Wharf Theater burned down, and by 1922 had been swept away by a fierce storm into the sea. But that didn't mean that theater was done in Provincetown. In fact, the activity moved to the west side of P-Town, to a barn of all places for a theater. Frank Shea, who was a bookseller and a fledgling playwright in his own right, actually opened his barn on the west side of Provincetown, and his troupe of players became known as the Barnstormers. And in fact, the Provincetown players also acted with Frank in the barn. And over time, a couple of factions actually formed of the Barnstormers. There was one that was dedicated to the avant-garde works of people like O'Neill and Glaspell and the St. Vincent Millay. But at the same time, there was another faction that was sort of stuck in tradition. And this was kind of led by an actress named Mary Bicknell, who eventually formed her own group of players called the Wharf Players. And they took residence in a little wharf theater again, which was sort of the second iteration of the wharf theaters in Provincetown. So this was at 83 Commercial Street, but there's a little piece of theater trivia that's sort of interesting here. There was no love lost between these two factions. And in fact, theater trivia tells us that the new wharf players left absconded with theater benches and props to prove their disdain for the Barnstormers before they inhabited their wharf theater. So, but that sort of takes us away from the very early years. That was probably into the 1930s. And there was also very early activity going on in other areas of Cape Cod. For example, on the Isle of Nantucket, there was an actors colony that formed in the town of Seaconset. And this was known as the Sconset Actors Colony. And it was actually made up of people who had long traditions. They were members of families that had long traditions in theater. And like the group in Provincetown, they were also looking for a place where they could see what their own pens could do and their own performances could do. So they began by performing in various locales around Sconset, and then created a really expansive artist colony, which in fact included a tennis court and a bowling alley. And then eventually they created what was called the Sconset Casino, which offered them a lot of space, a lot of room for big productions and for bigger audiences. So they were able to create some really spectacular productions at that time. And it's important to know that they were actually the seed for a group that continues to this day in Provincetown, in Nantucket. The Theater Workshop of Nantucket actually continues to produce everything from light comedy to serious drama, and have a long and continuing history on the island. So again, there were other areas, and another was Falmouth. If you take a short hop back across Nantucket Sound to the town of Falmouth, then there was a group that formed in the early 20s called the University Players. And the University Players, as their name implies, was made up of students from Harvard and Princeton and Radcliffe, and then a number of other universities and colleges in the area. And that actually became home to a number of soon-to-be luminaries, including Henry Fonda and Margaret Sullivan and the noted Broadway and film producer Joshua Logan. And in fact, in his autobiography, Joshua Logan talks about his starving artist days in West Falmouth and what that meant to him as he continued in his career. And he said that not only were they totally dedicated to their art, but they were also completely dedicated to each other. And that kind of dedication actually enabled them to create some spectacular productions. They, in fact, created a production of And All That Jazz that for all the world looks like a Busby Berkeley production. So, and this was a group of university students that did this. Sadly, they unfortunately disbanded after a few years, but that certainly didn't mean that theater history was done either on Cape Cod or in Falmouth. In fact, there was an early jewel in the crown of theater on Cape Cod, and that was the Falmouth Playhouse. And this was a magnificent structure that sat on the banks of the Coonamessett Lake. And in fact, it included not only a huge theater that, believe it or not, back in the 20s and 30s had a form of air conditioning, but it also had a restaurant and nightclub that overlooked the lake, and an oval-shaped European-style bar. And this became home to a number of stage and screen stars at the time too, including Tallulah Bankhead and Helen Hayes and Gertrude Lawrence, who we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, but she actually became the wife of Richard Aldridge, who at a point in the 1930s took over the running of the Falmouth Playhouse along with a number of other theaters on Cape Cod. But it was a magnificent structure, and again was home to so many stars. And that actually became a trademark for Richard Aldridge in his star machine that he brought to all four of the theaters that he owned and managed at one time. But again, we're getting sort of ahead of ourselves here. So I want to get back to some really early theater history. So the Cape Playhouse, which is the oldest continually operating summer theater in America. And this is in Dennis on 6A, which is the old King's Highway in Cape Cod. And the Cape Playhouse was actually the brainchild of Raymond Moore, who was one of the Provincetown players. And this is sort of a theme in Cape Cod theater, that again and again, the same names crop up because of the expansive and ever-growing theater culture. People sort of move from theater to theater, and it's continued to this day, really, that an actor might find a play that appeals to him in Provincetown, and then the next week be in a play at the Cape Cod Theater Company in Harwich. So this is sort of a theme of Cape Cod theater. So Moore was acting with the Provincetown Players and with the Barnstormers, and tried his hand at playwriting as well. But he decided that he wanted to start a theater in the commercial and business area of the Cape, so in the Mid-Cape area. So he began looking around in Yarmouth and Dennis, and then sort of really focused on Dennis, and actually found a building, the Nubscusset Meeting House, which was 200 years old, which he bought for the princely sum of $200. And then found a parcel of land, a 3-acre parcel off of 6A, off of the Old Kings Highway, and had the Nubscusset Meeting House moved there. And apparently this is something that happened more regularly around the turn of the centuries and into the teens and the 20s, that buildings were moved. So he found this parcel of land, and by 1927, he was ready to open the Cape Playhouse. And the first season, in fact, featured a performance by Basil Rathbone. And then the next season featured a performance by a newcomer, Henry Fonda, and another newcomer who actually got her start as an usher at the Cape Playhouse, and then got a little part in a play called Mr. Pym Stops By. Now that play will forever fall into obscurity, but the name of Betty Davis will stay with us forever. So that was a tradition that began bringing in stars to the Cape Playhouse, and but Moore had more on his mind than just a single theater. He wanted to create an art colony. And so he began using the buildings on the property. One was became a junior theater, and then one was a building for storing props and staging. And then another building became the Cape Cinema. Now, the Cape Cinema is still noted around the world for its classic feel and for its attention to classic films and to new avant-garde and foreign films. But it's also noted for a fabulous ceiling mural that was produced by artist Rockwell Kent. And so the cinema opened in 1930, and in fact was the site of the world debut of The Wizard of Oz. So unfortunately, by the 1930s, Moore was beginning to fail both physically and financially. And so he turned over his the management of the Cape Playhouse to Richard Aldridge, who was at that time the producing manager of the theater, and eventually became its owner. And then eventually owned 4 theaters, as we said, the Falmouth Playhouse and the Cape Music Circus, which became the Melody Tent, and then the South Shore Music Circus. And in all of those areas, he brought real star power. And again, as I said, that's continued in the Cape Playhouse, which continues to bring in luminaries every year. So, as I said, also Gertrude Lawrence was Mrs. A, how she was known lovingly around the Cape. And she was absolutely a force in the arts culture on the Cape and in the community around her. And in fact, there is a theater in the Dennis Union Church that bears her name, the Gertrude Lawrence Theater. So that's it. That's the dramatic early history of theater on Cape Cod, beginning in a sleepy little fishing village in Provincetown and creating an unbroken line of evolution that has transferred along the Cape and continues to this day. And as I said earlier, it has been kind of a hard time for theaters on the Cape. They were darkened, but they have continued to produce performances and presentations and classes virtually, and they'll be ready to take to the stage when it's time, because after all, the show must go on.
We're back with Sue Mellen. She's got a book called A History of Theater on Cape Cod. I want to mention that this book is available at Titcomb's Bookshop, the Provincetown Bookstore, bookshop or store?
Store, bookstore.
Yeah. The Buttonwood Bookstore in Cohasset, and it's also available through Acadia Publishing and Amazon if you must, and it's also at Barnes & Noble as well. So I wanted to bring up Gertrude Lawrence, because for us, Gertrude Lawrence has a portrait at the Eventide Theater Company, and she gazes down on all of us and all that we do there. So could you tell us a little bit about her?
Oh, and you also have a charming stage, the Gertrude Lawrence stage.
Yeah.
Right, in the Dennis Union Church. Right, well, she was Mrs. A. So she was married to Richard Aldridge, who was, of course, managed the Cape Playhouse for decades. For, I believe, 3 decades.
Yeah.
And at the same time was also managing 3 other theaters on...
Now, I've managed one, and I cannot imagine doing more than one at a time, so it really must have been...
But she was a force. She was absolutely incredible. In fact, she talked him into buying the property that became the Cape Music Circus, which is now the Melody Tent.
The Melody Tent, yes.
And that was because she had seen very successful tent theaters in Florida. And so she talked to Richard and convinced him that that would go on the Cape, and here we are.
And the Melody Tent, as is all the other theater institutions on the Cape, is still active and is going strong, and they're going to be coming back again this summer, and we look forward to that as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and she was a wonderful part of the community. People still talk about what a gracious hostess she was, that she really brought the theater community to the community. And I think that was a wonderful thing.
Now, one of the things that is challenging these days is to compete for the audience's attention with all of the amount of entertainment that's available to viewers in their own home. And yet live theater is thriving. What do you think accounts for that?
Well, I think that's it. I mean, I think it's live. And so when I'm reviewing a play, I absolutely love to watch young people in the audience. You watch them and their eyes go wide. You know, especially very young children, their eyes become as big as saucers when they're watching the witch on stage, who suddenly explodes in a puff of smoke. And they don't get that when they're at home. They're sitting like phantoms in front of a boob tube or in front of a computer screen, and that's entirely different. In a theater, they're interacting with what's going on stage.
I think that's one of my favorite things, is that it is such a social event to be at a play, and especially in the summer when you can be outside, you can see your friends, you can talk to them, and unfortunately that's something we haven't been able to do in the last year. But we're looking forward to that time where we can have an audience in the theater in front of us and create that kind of magic that happens between the performers and the audience itself. That's what the magic of theater is. It's that interaction, that exchange of energy between them.
Absolutely. Anybody who's ever acted, you miss that incredibly because it does. It plays back and forth. Yeah.
Now, we have lived through an unprecedented crisis in the last year and a half, and despite the fact that these theaters have been separated from audiences, and yet almost all the theaters remain and will be back. Now, what do you see for the future of Cape Cod theater?
Well, I know that, for instance, just this season, some theaters have full schedules. And I know Eventide has a full schedule coming up. So I think theater will continue to thrive because it always has.
Well, you were telling me while we were off for a minute that just about every cottage on the Cape has been rented for the summer. So I think we're going to see an unusually large amount of people who are coming here to the Cape. And,
well, and I think in all the arts, what we're going to see is a real renaissance. I mean, I really think that people have been hungry for the arts and for culture, and that they're absolutely going to devour it. The summer is the beginning. It's the beginning of that.
Chris, do we have any questions from our viewers they wanted to ask?
Sure. As a matter of fact, we do have a few folks who have sent some questions in. Steve Clothier, and I hope I'm saying that name correctly, actually asked, of all of the options for the cover of the book, is there any particular reason why you chose A Little Night Music from Monomoy Theater's June 2017 production?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Of all of the pictures that you could have chosen for the cover of the book, and we wanted to, somebody wants to know why you chose the 2017 production of A Little Night Music at Monomoy Theater.
Right. Well, I think it's just that picture is so full of life. You see her holding up her hand in a toast. And in fact, we were just talking about A Little Night Music. Little Night Music is a wonderful production. As we were just saying, even to act in that show, you have to be really good. Yeah, it's a wonderful show. It's one of my favorites. So I was really happy to have the option to have such a wonderful photo. I think it demonstrates theater at its best.
And there are a couple of other pictures here on the front. Can you tell us why? Yeah,
that's Princess Ida, and that comes from the College Light Opera Company. That goes back to about 1970.
Looks like it based on the costumes.
Right. And the other one, of course, goes back much further. That was from the original Arena Theater in Orleans, which eventually became the Academy of Performing Arts, the Academy Theater. And that's Dames at Sea.
Oh, Dames at Sea.
Dames at Sea.
And of course, on the back, we were talking earlier about the wharf in Provincetown, where the first production of Bound East for Cardiff was performed, and that's that wharf picture right there, right?
Right. Yeah. That's that.
Yes. Chris, any other questions?
Yes, actually. There's a mention that this discussion has had a lot of emphasis on the notion of Cape Cod theater as a summer theater destination or a summer season. And it was noted that there are an awful lot of theaters in this region that produce shows year-round, Eventide Theater being one of them, but also it was mentioned Harwich Junior Theater and the Academy Playhouse. And one of our attendees would like a little bit more, would love to hear your thoughts on Cape Cod theater year-round and its impact on the community.
Well, Sue and I were actually just talking about this during the video, and one of the things I've noticed since I've come here is that in the wintertime, you see more and more shows that are sold out, and that didn't used to happen. So not only is this a place where you can see theater in the summertime, but there's a rich amount of theatrical work that's being done in the winter and is highly popular in itself.
Right, and it's all along the Cape. I think that's important to know. It's certainly in Provincetown, and it's at Wellfleet Harbor.
Wellfleet,
right.
Falmouth Theater Guild.
Falmouth Theater Guild, absolutely. They're a wonderful group.
Barnstable Comedy Club.
Barnstable Comedy Club, which has been around for 100 years. And Harwich, certainly, the Cape Cod Theater Company, and Eventide.
Well, and we see that now, is that theater's a year-round business.
Right. Yeah.
The theater is more about, filling the houses during the full spread of the calendar. And we've seen it ourselves. We've seen it with a production we did, our last production, Assassins, which was in February, and sold out for its entire run. And it's very, very encouraging to see how theater is supported by the residents of the Cape and the people who are here year round.
Yeah, that's one thing we were talking about, the support from the community for theater groups, which is heartening.
Any other questions, Chris?
At this point, it looks like our chat room is quiet. So I think, Sue, you have answered every conceivable question about Cape Cod theater that our community has to ask.
Wow.
Well, it's a wonderful book, and we're so happy to be able to do this with you, Sue. I want to encourage everyone to go out and find a copy of History of Theater on Cape Cod. It has so many fascinating stories and tells you so much about this community, which has been resilient throughout the entire year and is looking forward to getting back and being able to perform for live audiences as well. So, Sue, thank you very much for being a part of this.
Thank you for having me.
We want to thank all of you for coming to view this, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you very much.